The morning sun was shining bright over London as three young tourists stepped off the red double-decker bus near Buckingham Palace. Jake, Madison, and Tyler had been friends since their first year of college, and this trip to Europe was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. They had saved up for months, working part-time jobs and eating cheap noodles just to afford this dream vacation. Jake was the troublemaker of the group. Back home, he was known for his wild pranks and crazy videos that always got tons of likes on social media. He had thick brown hair that always looked messy and a grin that usually meant he was up to something. Today was no different. He had his phone out, already filming everything they saw. Madison was the social media queen among them. She knew all the best angles for photos and could make even a boring sandwich look amazing on camera. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a bright pink jacket that she said would pop in photos. She was always checking her follower count and dreaming of becoming internet famous. Tyler was quieter than the other two, but he was the one with the best camera equipment. His dad had bought him an expensive camera for his birthday, and Tyler had learned how to use all the fancy settings. He was usually the one filming while Jake and Madison did their crazy stunts. The three friends had spent the previous night at a busy hostel in central London. The common room was packed with travelers from all over the world, sharing stories and showing off their photos. Jake had been bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about their big plan for the next day. "We're going to mess with those guys at the palace," Jake had announced, waving his beer bottle in the air. "You know, those dudes who just stand there like statues. I bet we can make them break character and laugh or something." A few older travelers had tried to warn them that it might not be such a good idea, but Jake just laughed it off. "Come on. They're just actors dressed up for tourists. It's all for show. What are they going to do, arrest us for taking funny pictures?" Madison had been scrolling through videos on her phone, showing everyone clips of other tourists posing with the guards. "Look at this one," she said, pointing to a video where someone was making silly faces next to a guard. "This has like 2 million views. If we do something even funnier, we could go viral." Tyler had been a bit more nervous about the whole thing, but he didn't want to seem like a wimp in front of his friends. Plus, he had to admit that the idea of getting a viral video was pretty exciting. His own social media accounts were pretty boring compared to Jake and Madison's, and he wanted to change that. Now, standing in front of the massive palace gates, the three friends felt like they were about to make internet history. The palace looked even more impressive in real life than it did in photos. The black iron gates were decorated with gold details that sparkled in the sunlight, and the building behind them looked like something from a fairy tale. But Jake wasn't interested in the architecture. His eyes were focused on the two guards, standing perfectly still at their posts. They wore the famous red coats and tall black hats that everyone associated with British royalty. Their faces showed no emotion at all, and they stared straight ahead, as if they couldn't see the crowds of tourists taking pictures around them. "This is perfect," Jake whispered to his friends, pulling out his phone and checking that it was recording. "Look at them just standing there. They're like human statues. This is going to be so easy." Madison was already fixing her hair and checking her makeup in her phone camera. She wanted to look perfect for what she was sure would be her big viral moment. "Should I go first, or do you want to?" she asked Jake. "Let's start small and work our way up," Jake replied, his mind already spinning with ideas. "Tyler, make sure you get everything on camera. We want to capture every second of this." The area around the palace was busy with tourists from all over the world. Families were taking group photos, couples were posing for selfies, and tour guides were leading groups around, pointing out different parts of the building and sharing historical facts. Nobody seemed to be paying much attention to what Jake, Madison, and Tyler were planning. What the three friends didn't know was that the guards they were looking at weren't just people in costumes. These were real soldiers from some of the most respected military units in Britain. The red coats they wore weren't just for show. They represented centuries of military tradition and honor. The guards standing at Buckingham Palace come from elite regiments like the Grenadier Guards, the Coldstream Guards, and the Scots Guards. These men and women have trained for months to earn the right to guard the royal family. Many of them have served in dangerous military missions around the world. They take their job very seriously, and they're not just there to look pretty for tourist photos. But Jake, Madison, and Tyler didn't know any of this. They had never bothered to read about the guards or learn about their history. To them, the guards were just another tourist attraction, like the changing of the guard ceremony or the palace tours. "Okay, here's the plan," Jake said, gathering his friends in a small circle so other tourists couldn't hear them. "We'll start with some normal photos, just standing next to them. Then we'll get a little more creative, maybe try to get them to smile or blink or something." Madison nodded excitedly. "And if that doesn't work, we can try touching their hats or something. I saw a video where someone did that and got like 5 million views." Tyler adjusted his camera settings, making sure everything was ready to capture their big moment. He was still feeling a little nervous about the whole thing, but the excitement from his friends was starting to rub off on him. "Just remember, we need to get it all in one take. We don't want to miss anything good." The three friends had no idea that their harmless fun was about to turn into one of the biggest mistakes of their lives. They thought they were just going to create some funny content for their social media accounts. They had no clue that they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about respect and consequences. As they walked closer to the guards, other tourists moved out of their way, sensing that something was about to happen. Some people started taking out their own phones, thinking they were about to witness something entertaining. A few families with small children moved a bit further away, as parents noticed the mischievous looks on the three friends' faces. Jake was practically bouncing with excitement as they got closer to the guards. This was going to be his big moment, the video that would finally make him internet famous. He had dreams of appearing on talk shows and getting invited to fancy events, all because of this one perfect video. Madison was thinking about all the followers she was going to gain and how jealous her friends back home would be when they saw her viral video. She could already picture herself being recognized on the street and getting free stuff from companies who wanted her to promote their products. Tyler was focused on getting the technical aspects right. He wanted to make sure the lighting was perfect and that the audio would be clear. He was already planning how he would edit the video to make it even funnier and more shareable. None of them realized that in just a few minutes, their dreams of internet fame were going to turn into a nightmare that would follow them for years to come. The three friends approached the first guard with their phones ready and huge grins on their faces. At first, they tried to act like normal tourists, taking regular selfies and group photos near the guard. Other visitors around them were doing the same thing, so nothing seemed unusual yet. Jake started things off by standing next to the guard and giving a thumbs up to Tyler's camera. The guard didn't move a muscle or even seem to notice that Jake was there. His eyes stayed focused straight ahead, and his face showed absolutely no expression. "This guy is like a robot," Jake whispered to Madison, loud enough for people nearby to hear. A few other tourists chuckled, and Jake felt encouraged by their reaction. "Watch this," he said, moving closer to the guard. Jake started making exaggerated poses next to the guard, pretending to march in place and copying the guard's serious expression. Madison was giggling and taking photos from different angles. Some of the other tourists were watching now, and a small crowd was starting to form around them. "Your turn, Madison," Jake said, stepping back so his friend could get closer to the guard. Madison approached the guard with her phone held high, ready to take the perfect selfie. But instead of just standing next to him like a normal tourist would, she decided to get creative. She started making funny faces at the camera while standing just inches away from the guard's stoic face. First, she stuck out her tongue and crossed her eyes. Then she made an exaggerated, surprised expression, opening her mouth wide and raising her eyebrows. The guard continued to stare straight ahead, completely ignoring her antics. "He's not even looking at me," Madison complained, getting frustrated that the guard wasn't reacting to her performance. "How am I supposed to make a funny video if he won't even acknowledge that I'm here?" "Try getting even closer," Jake suggested, his voice getting louder and more confident. "Maybe wave your hand in front of his face or something." Madison took Jake's advice and started waving her hand back and forth in front of the guard's eyes, trying to get him to blink or look at her. When that didn't work, she began making even sillier faces, sticking her tongue out further and making weird noises. Tyler was capturing everything on camera, zooming in to get close-ups of Madison's faces and the guard's unchanging expression. He was starting to feel more confident about their plan as he watched his friends get bolder and bolder. "This is great footage," Tyler called out, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. "You guys are definitely going viral with this." Jake was feeling pumped up by Tyler's encouragement and the attention they were getting from other tourists. Some people were laughing and taking their own photos and videos of the scene. Jake decided it was time to take things to the next level. "Step aside, amateurs," Jake announced dramatically, pushing past Madison to get closer to the guard. "Let me show you how it's really done." Jake positioned himself directly in front of the guard and started doing an exaggerated military salute, snapping his hand up to his forehead in an overly dramatic way. "Sir, yes, sir," he shouted loud enough for everyone around to hear. The guard didn't react at all, which only made Jake more determined to get a response. He started marching back and forth in front of the guard, lifting his knees high and swinging his arms in an exaggerated military style. "At ease, soldier boy," Jake yelled, thinking he was being hilarious. "I'm talking to you, statue man. Can you hear me in there?" Some of the tourists in the crowd were still laughing, but others were starting to look uncomfortable. A few families with children were moving away from the scene, and some older visitors were shaking their heads in disapproval. Madison wasn't ready to let Jake steal all the attention. She pushed back into the action, standing on the other side of the guard. "Hey, let me try something," she said, pulling out a pair of bright pink sunglasses from her bag. Before anyone could stop her, Madison reached up toward the guard's face, trying to put her sunglasses on him. "This will be so funny," she said, stretching up on her tiptoes to reach the tall guard's face. The guard remained perfectly still, but his eyes flickered slightly as Madison's hand approached his face. It was such a small movement that most people didn't notice it, but Tyler caught it on camera. Jake saw what Madison was doing and decided he wanted to one-up her. Without thinking about the consequences, he reached out and placed his hand on the guard's rifle, which was held at the guard's side. "Look at this old gun," Jake said loudly, running his fingers along the weapon. "I bet it's not even real. It's probably just a plastic prop for the tourists." The moment Jake's hand touched the rifle, something changed in the atmosphere around them. Several other tourists gasped and stepped back, suddenly realizing that what the three friends were doing had crossed a serious line. An older British man in the crowd spoke up loudly. "Young man, you shouldn't be touching that. Those are real soldiers with real weapons." But Jake was too caught up in the excitement of the moment to listen to the warning. He was enjoying all the attention and the feeling of being the center of everyone's focus. "Don't worry, old man," Jake called back with a laugh. "These guys are just for show. They can't even move." Madison was still trying to get her sunglasses onto the guard's face, stretching up and giggling as she attempted to hook them over his ears. "Come on, just one quick photo with these on," she was saying, as if the guard could hear her and might cooperate. Tyler was recording everything, moving around to get different angles and making sure he captured every moment of his friend's increasingly bold behavior. He was so focused on getting good footage that he wasn't paying attention to the concerned looks on other people's faces. "This is perfect," Tyler was saying from behind his camera. "You guys are being so funny. This is definitely going to break the internet." Jake was getting more and more excited as he realized how many people were watching them and taking their own videos. He started talking directly to Tyler's camera, as if he was hosting his own TV show. "Hey everyone, this is Jake, and we're here at Buckingham Palace messing with the Queen's guards," he announced loudly. "As you can see, these guys are basically just human statues. They can't do anything except stand there and look serious." To prove his point, Jake started walking in circles around the guard, talking loudly and gesturing wildly with his hands. He was treating the whole situation like it was his own personal comedy show, with the guard as an unwilling prop. Madison had given up on the sunglasses and was now trying to get the guard to look at her by jumping up and down and waving her arms. "Hey, statue man," she was calling out. "Look over here, don't you want to be in a viral video?" The crowd around them was getting bigger, with more and more people stopping to watch the spectacle. Some were laughing and encouraging the three friends, but others were looking increasingly worried about what they were witnessing. What Jake, Madison, and Tyler didn't realize was that their behavior was being watched by more than just curious tourists. Hidden cameras around the palace area were recording everything, and security personnel were already being alerted to the situation. The guards themselves were highly trained professionals who knew exactly how to handle situations like this, But they also knew that protocol required them to remain in position unless there was a serious threat. However, that didn't mean they were powerless, or that there wouldn't be consequences for the tourist's behavior. As Jake continued to touch the rifle and make jokes about it being fake, and as Madison kept trying to interact with the guard's face and uniform, they were unknowingly breaking several serious laws. What they thought was harmless fun was actually criminal behavior that could result in arrest and prosecution. The tension in the air was building, even though the three friends were too caught up in their performance to notice it. Other tourists were starting to back away, sensing that something was about to happen. Some people were putting away their phones, no longer finding the situation entertaining. But Jake, Madison, and Tyler were completely oblivious to the changing mood around them. They thought they were putting on the show of a lifetime, creating content that would make them internet stars. They had no idea that their moment of fame was about to turn into their worst nightmare. Everything changed in a single, terrifying moment. Jake was still laughing and running his hands along the guard's rifle when the unthinkable happened. Without any warning at all, the guard who had been standing perfectly still suddenly exploded into action. It was like watching a statue come to life. But instead of being magical, it was absolutely terrifying. In one smooth, lightning-fast movement, the guard stepped forward with his left foot and brought his rifle up across his chest. In what's called the port arms position, the movement was so quick and precise that it looked like it had been practiced thousands of times, which it had. Then came the shout. "Make way for the Queen's Guard!" The words thundered across the courtyard like a cannon blast. The guard's voice was so powerful and commanding that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath everyone's feet. It wasn't just loud. It was the kind of authoritative military command that immediately made everyone within hearing distance stop whatever they were doing and pay attention. Jake, who had been leaning against the rifle just a second before, stumbled backward so fast that he nearly fell over. His face went from cocky and confident to shocked and terrified in an instant. His phone, which he had been holding up to take a selfie with the rifle, flew out of his hands and clattered onto the stone pavement. Madison, who had been standing on her tiptoes trying to put sunglasses on the guard's face, dropped her arms immediately and jumped back as if she had been electrocuted. Her bright pink sunglasses fell to the ground, and her carefully styled hair was suddenly a mess as she stumbled away from the guard. Tyler, who had been recording everything from behind, his expensive camera was so startled by the sudden shout that he nearly dropped his equipment. His hands were shaking as he tried to keep filming, but the camera was wobbling all over the place. The guard's shout had been so unexpected and so powerful that it created a moment of complete silence in the usually busy area around the palace. For about 3 seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, and nobody seemed to even breathe. But then, as if someone had pressed a play button, everything started happening at once. First, more guards appeared, not just one or two, but several of them, seeming to come from nowhere all at once. It was like they had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for exactly this moment. Some came from doorways that tourists hadn't even noticed. Others seemed to materialize from behind pillars and walls. Each guard moved with the same precise military efficiency as the first one. Their boots made sharp clicking sounds on the stone pavement as they marched into position around the 3 stunned tourists. Within seconds, Jake, Madison, and Tyler found themselves surrounded by tall, serious-looking soldiers in red coats and black hats. But the guards weren't the only ones who appeared. Palace security officers, dressed in dark suits and wearing earpieces, emerged from concealed positions around the area. These weren't the friendly tour guides that tourists usually interacted with. These were serious security professionals who looked like they meant business. The tourist who had been watching and laughing just moments before suddenly realized this wasn't part of some entertaining show. Parents quickly grabbed their children and pulled them away from the scene. Older visitors who had been trying to warn the 3 friends earlier now looked vindicated but also concerned about what was going to happen next. Jake was the first to try to speak, but his voice came out as a shaky whisper. We didn't mean... He couldn't even finish his sentence. The confident, loud young man who had been making jokes and touching military equipment just minutes before had completely disappeared. Madison was standing with her mouth open, staring up at the guards who now surrounded them. Her face had gone completely pale, and she looked like she might start crying at any moment. All her dreams of viral fame were crashing down around her as she realized just how serious the situation had become. Tyler was still holding his camera, but his hands were shaking so badly that the footage would be completely unusable. He kept looking around at all the guards and security officers, trying to count how many there were, but there seemed to be more appearing every few seconds. The original guard, the one who had shouted the command, remained in his alert position with his rifle across his chest. His eyes, which had seemed to look right through the tourist before, were now focused directly on them with laser-like intensity. There was something in his gaze that made it very clear he was not someone to mess around with. One of the security officers stepped forward and spoke in a calm but firm voice. "You three need to come with us immediately." It wasn't a request, it was a command, delivered in the same authoritative tone as the guard's shout, but quieter and more controlled. "But we didn't do anything wrong," Madison finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "We were just taking pictures like everyone else." The security officer didn't seem impressed by her explanation. Touching military equipment and interfering with the Queen's Guard is not just taking pictures. You've broken several laws, and you need to understand how serious this situation is. Jake tried to bend down to pick up his phone, but one of the guards immediately stepped closer to him and Jake froze. "Don't move," the security officer instructed. "Everything will be collected as evidence." Evidence. The word hit all three friends like a punch to the stomach. This wasn't just about getting in trouble or being asked to leave. They were talking about evidence, which meant police, which meant they could actually be arrested. Tyler finally lowered his camera, realizing that continuing to film was probably making things worse. "Look, we're really sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't know we weren't supposed to. We thought it was okay because we saw other people taking pictures." "Other people weren't touching military weapons," the security officer replied. "Other people weren't attempting to place objects on the guards or interfering with their duties. What you did was completely different, and there are serious consequences for this kind of behavior." More security personnel were arriving now, including what looked like police officers in regular uniforms. The area around the palace, which had been full of happy tourists just minutes before, was now looking more like a crime scene. The three friends stood huddled together, surrounded by guards and security officers, while other tourists watched from a safe distance. Many people were still recording with their phones, but now they were capturing the aftermath of the incident, rather than the prank itself. Jake kept looking around desperately, as if hoping someone would tell him this was all just a misunderstanding that could be easily cleared up. But the serious expressions on everyone's faces made it clear that this was very real and very serious. Madison was starting to cry now, tears running down her cheeks as she realized that their fun vacation was turning into a nightmare. All the followers and likes she had been dreaming about seemed completely unimportant now, compared to the possibility of being arrested in a foreign country. Tyler was thinking about his parents back home, and how disappointed they would be if they found out he had been arrested. He was also worried about his expensive camera equipment and whether he would be allowed to keep it or if it would be taken away as evidence. The security officer was speaking into his radio, using codes and terms that the three friends didn't understand. Whatever he was saying, it was clear that more people were being called to the scene and that the situation was being treated very seriously by everyone involved. As they stood there waiting to find out what would happen next, Jake, Madison, and Tyler were beginning to understand that their harmless prank had been anything but harmless. They were learning in the most frightening way possible that the guards at Buckingham Palace weren't just decorations or performers. They were real soldiers, with real authority, real weapons, and the full backing of the British legal system. And now these three tourists were about to find out exactly what that meant. The next few hours felt like the longest day of their lives. Within 10 minutes of the guards' thunderous command, 2 police cars had arrived at the scene with their blue lights flashing. The sight of actual police vehicles made the situation feel incredibly real and serious in a way that nothing else could have. 4 Metropolitan police officers got out of the cars, and they looked nothing like the friendly neighborhood cops from American movies. These officers were professional, serious, and clearly experienced in dealing with situations involving tourists who had gotten themselves into trouble. "Right then," said the lead officer, a tall woman with graying hair and sharp eyes. "I understand. We have 3 individuals who have been interfering with the Queen's Guard and touching military equipment." Jake tried one more time to explain their side of the story. "Officer, we really didn't know we were doing anything wrong. We're just tourists from America, and we thought the guards were like actors or something for tourists to take pictures with." The officer looked at him with an expression that made it clear she had heard this excuse many times before. "Ignorance of the law is not a defense, young man. These are active duty soldiers from Her Majesty's military, and what you've done constitutes several serious offenses." Madison was crying harder now, and her carefully applied makeup was running down her face in black streaks. "Please, we're really sorry. We didn't mean to hurt anyone or cause any trouble. Can't you just give us a warning or something?" "I'm afraid it's beyond that point now," the officer replied. "You'll need to come with us to the station for questioning. Your belongings will be seized as evidence, and you'll be formally charged." The word "charged" hit them like a physical blow. Tyler's expensive camera was taken from his hands by one of the security officers, who placed it carefully in an evidence bag. Jake's phone, which was still lying on the ground where he had dropped it, was also bagged up along with Madison's sunglasses and her phone. "This is evidence in a criminal investigation," the officer explained as she watched their phones disappear into plastic bags. "You'll get them back eventually, but not until after the investigation is complete." The 3 friends were then searched quickly but thoroughly before being placed in handcuffs. The metal cuffs were cold and heavy, and the clicking sound they made as they locked into place seemed to echo in the suddenly quiet courtyard. "Is this really necessary?" Tyler asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "We're not dangerous or anything. We're just college students on vacation." "Standard procedure," the officer replied without any sympathy in her voice. "You've been arrested on suspicion of harassment, breach of the peace, and assault on military personnel. The handcuffs stay on until you're processed at the station." Assault. That word made Jake's stomach drop even further. He had never thought of touching the rifle as assault, but apparently the law saw it very differently. "Assault? But I didn't hit anyone or hurt anyone," he protested weakly. "Touching military equipment without permission is considered assault under British law," the officer explained. "The fact that you're American tourists doesn't change that." As they were being led toward the police cars, dozens of other tourists were watching and recording everything with their phones. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They had wanted to create a viral video, and now they definitely had one, but they were the ones being arrested in it. Madison couldn't stop sobbing as she was helped into the back of one of the police cars. The leather seat was hard and uncomfortable, and there was a thick piece of plastic separating her from the front seats where the officer sat. It felt like being in a cage. Jake and Tyler were put in the second police car, and as they drove away, from Buckingham Palace they could see the crowds of tourists still gathered around the area where they had been arrested. Some people were pointing at the police cars, clearly discussing what they had just witnessed. The ride to the police station took about 15 minutes, during which none of them spoke. They were all thinking about the same things, how they were going to explain this to their parents, whether they would be thrown in jail, and whether this would ruin their futures. The police station was a gray, intimidating building that looked nothing like the cozy British settings they had seen in movies. Inside it was all fluorescent lights, hard benches, and the sound of keyboards clicking as officers filled out paperwork. They were processed one by one, which meant being separated from each other for the first time since their arrest. Each of them had to give their personal information, have their fingerprints taken, and pose for mugshots that would go into the British criminal database. Madison was the first to completely break down during processing. When the officer asked for her parents' contact information so they could be notified of her arrest, she started crying so hard that she could barely speak. "My dad is going to kill me," she sobbed. "He's already worried about me traveling in Europe, and now I'm calling him from jail. What am I supposed to say? How do I explain this?" The processing officer, a middle-aged man who had clearly seen this situation many times before, handed her a tissue but didn't offer any comforting words. You'll have a chance to call your family once processing is complete. You might want to think about what you're going to say. Jake's processing went slightly better, mainly because he was trying to hold himself together and not break down like Madison had. But when the officer explained the charges against him, the reality of the situation really hit home. You're being charged with harassment, breach of the peace, and assault on military personnel. The officer read from his computer screen. The assault charge is the most serious, as it involves interfering with active duty military equipment. That can carry a sentence of up to 6 months in prison and a fine of up to £5,000. £5,000. Jake did the math quickly in his head. That was more than $6,000. His part-time job at home paid minimum wage, and it would take him months to save up that much money, assuming he could even get the money together at all. Tyler's processing was the most difficult, because he was the one who had been recording everything. The officers were particularly interested in his camera and wanted to know exactly what he had filmed and whether he had uploaded anything to social media yet. "We'll need to examine all the footage on your camera," the officer told him. "Depending on what we find, you could face additional charges related to the distribution of images of military personnel and security arrangements." Tyler hadn't even thought about that possibility. He had just been focused on getting good footage for their video, but now he realized that filming around the palace might have captured things he wasn't supposed to see. After processing, they were each placed in separate holding cells to wait for what the officers called further questioning. The cells were small, cold, and completely bare, except for a hard bench and a toilet in the corner. There were no windows, and the only light came from a harsh fluorescent bulb in the ceiling. Jake sat on the bench in his cell and tried to figure out how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. Just a few hours ago, he had been excited about creating funny content for social media. Now he was sitting in a British jail cell, facing the possibility of a criminal record that could follow him for the rest of his life. Madison was in the cell next to his, and he could hear her crying through the thin walls. Every few minutes, she would call out, "I want to go home," in a voice that sounded like a scared little girl rather than the confident social media influencer she had been that morning. Tyler was in the cell on the other side, and he was completely silent. Jake wondered if he was sleeping, or just sitting there in shock like Jake was. The whole situation felt like a bad dream that they couldn't wake up from. Hours passed slowly in the holding cells. They were given water and some basic food, but none of them felt like eating. Their minds were racing with worry about what was going to happen to them and how they were going to get out of this mess. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, officers came to get them for formal questioning. One by one, they were taken to interview rooms where they had to answer detailed questions about what they had done and why they had done it. The questions were thorough and professional. The officers wanted to know exactly how they had planned their prank, whether they had researched the guards beforehand, and whether they understood that they were breaking the law. Each of them tried to explain that they had just been having fun and didn't realize how serious the situation was, but the officers weren't interested in excuses. They were building a case, collecting evidence, and making sure they had everything they needed to prosecute the 3 American tourists who had thought they could treat British soldiers like props in their social media videos. 12 hours after their arrest, Jake, Madison, and Tyler were finally released from the police station. But their nightmare was far from over. They had each been formally charged and would have to appear in court within the next few days. The charges were serious enough that they couldn't just pay a fine and walk away. Jake faced the most severe consequences because he had actually touched the guard's rifle, which constituted assault on military personnel under British law. Their phones and camera equipment were still being held as evidence, which meant they had no way to contact anyone back home, except through the one phone call they had been allowed to make from the police station. Those phone calls had been some of the most difficult conversations of their lives. Jake's parents had been shocked and disappointed when he called to explain what had happened. His father, a quiet man who had worked hard to save money for Jake's college education, had been almost speechless when he heard that his son was facing criminal charges in England. "I don't understand, Jake," his father had said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "We raised you better than this. How could you think it was okay to mess around with soldiers and their weapons?" Madison's call home had been even worse. Her mother had started crying immediately when she heard that Madison was in jail, and her father had been so angry that he could barely speak coherently. "Do you have any idea what this could do to your future?" her father had shouted into the phone. "Criminal charges in a foreign country. This could affect everything, your college applications, job prospects, even your ability to travel. How could you be so stupid?" Tyler's parents had been the most practical, immediately starting to research lawyers and trying to figure out what they needed to do to help their son. But even they couldn't hide their disappointment and worry about what this would mean for Tyler's future. The three friends were staying at the same hostel they had been at before their arrest, but everything felt different now. Other travelers looked at them strangely, and word had spread about what had happened. Some people were sympathetic, but others clearly thought they had gotten what they deserved. Without their phones, they felt completely cut off from the world. They knew. They couldn't check social media, couldn't call their friends, and couldn't even look up information about what was happening to them. The hostel had a computer they could use for a few minutes at a time, but everything they tried to research about British law and criminal charges just made them feel more worried. 3 days after their arrest, they had to appear in Westminster Magistrates' Court for their preliminary hearing. The courtroom was intimidating, with high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and a serious-looking judge who clearly had no patience for foolish tourists. Jake's case was heard first because his charges were the most serious. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman in a black robe, explained to the court exactly what Jake had done and why it was considered such a serious offense. "Your Honor, the defendant deliberately touched military equipment belonging to an active duty soldier of Her Majesty's Guard," she said in a crisp, professional voice. "This constitutes assault on military personnel, harassment, and breach of the peace. The defendant showed complete disregard for British law and military tradition." Jake's court-appointed lawyer tried to argue that it had been a harmless prank, and that Jake hadn't understood the seriousness of his actions, but the judge wasn't buying it. "Ignorance of the law is not an excuse," the judge said sternly, looking directly at Jake. "These guards are highly trained soldiers who deserve respect, not harassment from tourists looking for social media content. Your behavior was disrespectful, illegal, and potentially dangerous." Jake was fined $2,500, about $3,100, plus court costs, which brought his total penalty to nearly $4,000. He was also given a formal caution that would stay on his criminal record for several years. Madison and Tyler each received fines of $1,500, about $1,900, plus court costs for harassment and breach of the peace. While their penalties were smaller than Jake's, they were still substantial amounts for college students who were supposed to be on a budget vacation. But the financial penalties were just the beginning of their problems. The court proceedings had attracted attention from local news media, and their story was picked up by several British newspapers and websites. Headlines like "American tourists arrested for mocking Queen's Guard" and "Disrespectful visitors face justice after palace incident" appeared online, often accompanied by photos from their arrest. The story spread quickly from British media to American news outlets, and soon their names and photos were appearing on news websites back home. Social media users began sharing their story, but not in the way they had originally hoped. Instead of being celebrated as funny pranksters, they were being criticized as examples of ugly American tourists who had no respect for other countries and their traditions. Comment sections were filled with harsh criticism, with people calling them entitled, disrespectful, and stupid. Their universities back home launched disciplinary investigations after the international incident reflected poorly on their institutions. Jake was called into a meeting with the dean of students, who explained that the university was considering suspending him for behavior that damaged the school's reputation. "Our students are representatives of this institution wherever they go," the dean told him. "When you act irresponsibly abroad and it becomes international news, it reflects badly on all of us. We're reviewing whether you should be allowed to continue your studies here." Madison faced similar consequences at her school, where she had been active in student government and several clubs. She was asked to resign from her leadership positions, and several organizations she belonged to asked her to leave voluntarily rather than face formal expulsion. Tyler's situation was particularly complicated because his father worked for a company that did business internationally. His father's employer was not happy about the negative publicity, and Tyler's father was worried that his son's arrest could affect his own job security. The three friends also discovered that their arrest had created problems for their future travel plans. Having criminal records in the UK meant that they would face extra scrutiny anytime they tried to travel to other countries, and some destinations might refuse to allow them entry at all. Their European vacation, which was supposed to last another 2 weeks, was cut short when their visa status was reviewed following their convictions. Immigration officials made it clear that they were no longer welcome as tourists and would need to leave the country immediately after their court hearing. The flight home was miserable. They sat in separate rows because they could barely stand to look at each other, each one blaming the others for their shared disaster. The excitement and friendship that had brought them to Europe together had been completely destroyed by the consequences of their actions. When they arrived back in the United States, they were greeted by reporters at the airport who had heard about their story. Photos of them looking tired, embarrassed, and defeated appeared in newspapers and on websites, cementing their reputation as the American tourists who had humiliated themselves and their country abroad. Jake never fully recovered from the financial burden of his fines and legal costs. He had to take out additional student loans to stay in school, and the stress of the situation affected his grades badly. He eventually changed his major and graduated a year later than planned. Madison found that her dream of becoming a social media influencer was effectively over. Every time she tried to post content, people would recognize her as that girl who got arrested at Buckingham Palace and leave negative comments. She eventually deleted all her social media accounts and changed her career plans completely. Tyler's expensive camera equipment was eventually returned to him, but the footage from that day was permanently deleted as part of his sentence. He lost interest in photography and filmmaking after the incident, feeling that his equipment reminded him too much of the worst mistake of his life. Years later, all three of them would still occasionally be recognized by people who remembered their story. Job interviews became difficult because many employers would Google their names and find articles about their arrest. Background checks for apartments, loans, and other important life events were complicated by their criminal records. They had learned, in the hardest way possible, that the royal guards at Buckingham Palace are not tourist attractions or props for social media content. They are highly trained, highly respected soldiers from elite military units with centuries of proud history and tradition. The Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and Welsh Guards who rotate through duty at royal residences have served with distinction in conflicts around the world. Many have combat experience and have earned medals for bravery and service to their country. These soldiers undergo months of rigorous training before they earn the right to guard the royal family. They learn not just military skills, but also the precise ceremonial movements and protocols that are part of their duties. Standing perfectly still for hours at a time while tourists take photos and sometimes behave badly is just one small part of their job, but it requires incredible discipline and professionalism.